So for those of you who are joining us for the very first time tonight, I just want to introduce myself very briefly. I'm John Fields, and I'm the Senior Director for the Abrams Engel Institute for the Visual Arts. We like to refer to ourselves as AEIVA, which is an acronym for that title. We are a visual arts center located on the campus of the University of Alabama at Birmingham. We present 8 to 10 exhibitions a year, highlighting a mix of regionally, nationally, and internationally acclaimed artists, focused almost exclusively on contemporary art. We serve a diverse audience of university faculty, staff and students, artists, museum patrons, and donors, local institutions, as well as the national and international visual arts community, while simultaneously striving to keep our exhibitions directly relevant and engaging to our surrounding Birmingham communities. Since our opening in 2014, AEIVA has been featured in the New York Times, the Huffington Post, The Nation, Raw Vision Magazine, and on PBS Canvas. And last week's AEIVA Inside the Arts episode featured Philip Martin Gallery in LA and got us a little shout out this morning on Art Forum. We are proud that all of our exhibitions and related educational programming are free and open to the public. So if you have a good time tonight, we would absolutely love for you to join us again. I really want to thank Brendan and Sarah from Karma Gallery for working with us to make this happen tonight. And of course, thanks to Thaddeus for taking time to hang out with us this evening. And I will now turn it over to AEIVA's Assistant Curator, Tina Ruggieri, who spearheaded tonight's event.
Thank you. So as John mentioned, my name is Tina Ruggieri, and I am the Assistant Curator at AEIVA. First, just let me start by welcoming everyone, new faces and our regulars, to our Inside the Arts series. This program that we started at AEIVA to give galleries and artists an opportunity to share with our patrons their current exhibitions. Tonight, I would like to thank Brendan Dogon and Sarah Blage from Karma Gallery in New York City, and the amazing Thaddeus Mosley for working with us at AEIVA on tonight's talk. I want to begin by introducing Brendan and telling everyone a little about Karma Bookstore and Gallery, and then I will introduce tonight's speaker, Thaddeus Mosley. Brendan began his career as a graphic designer. He founded Karma Bookstore in 2011 and has designed publications for artists such as Jonas Wood, Richard Prince, Rob Pruitt, and Sam Falls, as well as some of the largest galleries in the world, including Gagosian and Hauser-Wirth, just to name a couple. He's a book trader, designer, and gallerist. While talking to W Magazine in 2013, Brendan stated that, quote, "People are always trying to figure us out," end quote. And that is exactly what I love and find interesting about Karma and Brendan's program over these years. He has shown and represented artists such as Will Boone, Mark Flood, Anne Craven, Peter Halley, Nicholas Party, Matthew Wong, Marley Freeman, and of course, tonight's guest, Thaddeus Mosley. Thaddeus Mosley was born in 1926 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He is a self-taught artist, and Mosley's monumental sculptures are crafted with the felled trees of Pittsburgh's urban canopy via the city's Forestry Division, wood from local sawmills, and reclaimed building materials. Using only a mallet and chisel, Thaddeus reworks salvaged timber into biomorphic forms. His influences range from Noguchi to Brâncuși, as well as from the African sculptures pulled from his own personal collection. His, quote, "sculptural improvisations," end quote, as he calls them, take cues from the modernist traditions of jazz, which I'm sure we will be hearing a bit more about in Thaddeus's talk. Thaddeus' work has been exhibited and acquired in major museums and foundations since 1959, including the Mattress Factory Museum in Pittsburgh, and most recently, the Carnegie Museum of Art for the occasion of the 57th edition Carnegie International held in 2018. I would like to now turn this over to Thaddeus, and we will be sharing a selection of installation images from Karma on your screen while Thaddeus is talking.
Well, good evening. I have to make a correction. I was born in Newcastle, Pennsylvania, which is about 50 miles north of here. But I've been in Pittsburgh longer than I've been anywhere else. So Pittsburgh is really my home now. So I would like to think that the work speaks for itself. So I don't know about how I'll make a long talk. But anyhow, I'll start by saying I went to University of Pittsburgh, which is right across the street from the Carnegie Museum. And I had a friend that was a painter, and we used to go to look at the Carnegie Internationals all the time. And those were some of the main things that sparked my interest in sculpture. This, of course, is the show up in one wing of the Karma Gallery, and the far sculpture to the right, that was probably the last piece I made before it went into the Carnegie International in October 2018. And I guess we should probably have a long question and answer period. But the sculpture in the forefront, which you really can't see because there's another sculpture behind it. But I will say that my work is based on the principle of spatial concept of weight and space. So you should get a feeling of rising and levitation and movement, even though the pieces are stable. And I hope they always stand up. I haven't had any accidents with things falling over, but and most of the pieces are done in walnut or cherry, and most of I have a great many gouges and chisels and mallets and stuff, and I use a chainsaw to make sure the bottoms are flat and so the pieces stand. And again, I would like to think that it's very difficult to see pieces that are photographed, and all of you who one day can get to New York, and maybe we'll do this again with Brendan's help, so you'll see some of the pieces. Now, the piece to the far right in this photograph, that's done from my second show at the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. That was in the 97. And that, but in the forefront is a round figure of sculpture and an oval, and that was done for the last Carnegie International show, and it's walnut, and of course, again, the weight is in space. Behind that is a piece that wasn't in the International, but it was done in 2016 and was shown at the Rogue Gallery in New York in 2016. It was brand new at that time. So anyhow, it's then it's two forms similar, with a log cut in half, and can't see the other side. The other side has cut through patterns, and some of these pieces had never been out of the studio, had never been shown, and the piece on the far right, which is cherry and walnut with the wrap over top of the other sculpture. So that was the first time that piece has been shown. I'm not good on dates, but I imagine it was done about 3 or 4 years ago. And speaking mainly on what I've done and how long I've been doing this, I started in the 50s, and probably my first shows were what they call the festival, Three Rivers Festival, which is held down at the river in the park there, and that was in the late 50s, early 60s. And then from then, I had a first show at the Carnegie in 1968, and I showed with the Associated Artists Society Sculptors. We have, at that time, we had many art organizations in Pittsburgh. Group A, which was the abstract group, and I headed up 2 or 3 of these organizations. They're always looking for someone who's willing to work. So I headed up some of those organizations. And some of these pieces, like, again, hadn't been out of the studio. So it was really good to see them standing up in some of the things that Brendan chose. Weren't my favorites, but anyhow, I try to do a consistent job so I don't have to hide too many of the pieces, and I'm willing to show them. And so I worked. I've had 2 marriages. I had 6 children, 3 by my first wife and 3 by my second. So I took care of children, and also spent a lot of time working. For a while, I had a backyard studio. So after work, my employment at the Postal Service, I would come home and spend 5 or 6 hours a day after work working on them. Weekends, I worked maybe 10 or 12 hours, depending on what commitments I've had. So again, I'm going to wait until the questions come up, and I can talk a little bit more about the what different sculptures mean. The one on the far right with the iron is a very linear, but that is actually a braking system from the railroad. And when I lived on South Side, there was a big railroad yard, and they threw away things, and I liked that idea of that shape, and so I made it into a sculpture with a plain wing on top. In the far right is I call it 4-pronged sculpture, all out of walnut. It was the first time that has been shown. It's done about 3 or 4 years ago. I work all the time, so I always have a fair amount of work on hand, you know. And even though I'm getting up in age, or I'm not getting, I'm already up there. I'll be 94 in a couple months. But I've always enjoyed Good Hill, and I was lucky enough to inherit, I guess, genes that didn't move too fast. So I've maintained a sort of a slow growth, and that's not only in getting old, but I never got too tall also. But this is a sculpture I did, I guess maybe 6, 7, 8 years ago. I can't remember, but it's called Geometric Plateau, I think. Then you see the idea of geometry. You see the planes, you see the cones, you see the circle, and you'll see a sort of a triangular shape. And also, all the elements are carved out, and so that they sort of blend and contrast at the same time.
So, Thaddeus, I wanted to ask you a quick question. So,
yeah.
I know that I've read and I've heard you talk about how your work is relates and is influenced by, you know, jazz music, the improvisation of jazz music. Can you talk a little bit about that in relation to your sculptures?
Well, I'm a great jazz fan, and I've played music every day, and I've heard most of the greats that come through Pittsburgh, and go to New York to hear people play. And I came along and what I sort of consider the golden age of jazz. I started listening when I was a youngster in the 30s. So by the time I was in the 40s, I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and of course, all the jazz groups would come to town, so we would see them through the 40s and 50s. But my pieces aren't so much influenced by jazz as so much I name some of the pieces after as tribute to some of the great jazz musicians. But speaking of my influences, mainly have been Brâncuși and Noguchi in tribal African arts, and tribal African arts in getting to the essence of shape, and also the marks of the tools that create rhythm, tension. Those have been my main sort of influences, and I hope I got near to the question.
Yeah. So one thing I'm interested in is what is it about wood that attracted you as your personal artistic medium?
Well, 2 or 3 things. How I got started was that in the early 50s, Scandinavian design furniture really hit big in Western Pennsylvania, the stores. And in fact, there used to be a store that specialized in Scandinavian design, from furniture to uh, glassware and everything else. But in the brochures and around the furniture, they always had a little sculptures, or in the books they had large sculptures in the room. Well, and when they had a lot of birds and fish on teak, they were made of teak and they were on brass wires. And I looked at those. I said, "Well, I can do that." So I just took 2x4s and I got steel rotting, and I made my interpretations of those Scandinavian Swedish sculptures, and I also bought uh, Scandinavian furniture. Was my favorite design furniture, and still is. I think that the beauty of the wood and so forth, the warmth, and the fact that they've always had included sculpture in the room with the work, and that's one of the ideas of my sculptures, that I always feel that these new interiors with very cold and white steel and glass furniture, what they really need is the warmth of wood. Now, how I got started with wood was I lived in Pittsburgh, and the Park Service here, they always cut down trees, trees that are diseased or falling and whatnot. So the wood was available. I mean, it was uh, no price on it. So that was a big attraction. And you could always get wood. Your only competition was that people who had fireplaces, they liked the same wood that you use for carving hardwoods because it would burn longer. So uh, walnut or cherry or fruit woods were a premium. So that's, but as I kept working and got more particular, I started going to sawmills and where I could pick out certain types of logs, height, and even shape, because the shape of the tree uh, sometimes dictates what the final sculpture will look like. I recently, last year, I went down and I looked at curved logs, and I bought maybe 4 or 5 curved logs. And in fact, I just finished this week. I finished a sculpture with 4 curved logs in them. So in it. So anyhow, that determines a good deal what the sculpture is going to look like. But also as I began to carve, I had affinity for wood, and I began to look at the colors, the shapes, the textures, and so forth. And so I think one thing about wood, as compared to something like steel or clay, you have a warmth, a natural warmth. You have a natural beauty, and of course, no tree or no log is the same. So you have that variety.
So when you go to, pick out your logs or larger pieces of wood, do you start to see a sculpture immediately, or do you have to bring it back to your studio and work with it?
When I go down to, sometimes I have things in mind, and like I want to do a large sculpture, 10 or 12 foot tall. If height and size is important, you have to go down. Sometimes I would call and find out what they have, but the main thing is that the it is when you get, sometimes you see something that you might like, or say, well, yeah, that's an idea. But most of the time, maybe I used to buy a lot more, but I buy 15 or 30 logs. So I just have enough stuff so I can pick and choose, or make a variety of shapes. So, and as I get the logs and look at them for a while, move them around, and then ideas start to come. Sometimes they come fast, sometimes they come slower. But the main thing is that sooner or later something will happen with the idea of that log. And most of them are, the log itself is, to me, is a very interesting element. Without you doing any to them, some of them you could just stand them up.
Mm-hmm. So, let's see. I had a message from someone. It says you rarely sketch your designs. How do you conceive the shapes and forms of your work?
Oh well, I don't. The only time I do a sketch or something like that, if there's going to be a commission and people want to see what you're going to do. I've done models. I've done for the convention center here in Pittsburgh. I've done what you call the Three Rivers Bench. It's about 18 foot long, and I had to make a model. But most things, I look at the log, or I look at 2 or 3 logs, because most of my things are more than one component. Mm-hmm. So, and I say, well, this will go with this, and this will go with that. And I try to make something that reflects that idea. So sometimes I'm successful, and sometimes things come out a little better than I thought, and sometimes they don't come out as well as I would like to see them. But the idea, the joy is making something. You know, is that for me? I know people come and they say, "Oh, how many assistants do you have?" I said, "I don't have any assistants. This is like I'm a professional hobbyist. I enjoy making things, and I'm not making them production-wise for money. I'm making them because I like to do a sculpture."
I have another question that came in about, do you treat any of your wood, or do you leave it natural?
Well, all the wood is treated when it's done, because I used to use linseed oil and mineral spirits, but oil makes the wood very dark, and then the oil dries out, so it needs sort of some type of maintenance. But I use then I switched to polyacrylic, and it's a finish that leaves the wood pretty much in its natural state and color. And and then I use a combination of beeswax and orange oil. But anything that will really enhance and bring out the natural properties of the wood, I use.
So I have another question. If you could talk about how how you think about the connections of the pieces. They appear as delicate and lyrical, although they are actually massive, is the statement.
Well, connecting. Now, I don't know if you mean the idea of a single piece or sculpts connecting one to the other, but in a piece that such as on screen, I get the idea. And now sometimes pieces are dovetailed, and sometimes they're a mortise tenon. Sometimes they're done with metal pegs, but a lot of times have used like a tenon, but sometimes if there's a danger of the wood breaking, I use a metal rod, because the rod is not going to rot or break. So anyhow, I use actually what looks like it's going to be the most stable, and also sometimes the most aesthetic looking connection. I try to make the connection such though it blends right with the shape and sculpture of the wood. But my pieces are designed so they all come apart and come back together. Go back together. I always tell people it's not the sculpture that is my talent. It's making things that will come apart and go back is my main talent. So because I remember when I first started showing out of town years ago, and movers would come and they say, well, these things are impossible to move. I said, no, they're not. They all come apart. They say, really? I said, yeah, and they go back together. So that's what made them portable.
To speak to that, how do you arrive at a finished piece? How do you know when you have completed one?
Well, pretty much, since I don't really, I draw right on with colored chalks right on the wood. So I have pretty much an idea of how I want the piece to work and how to fit. If you look at the piece that's on the screen now, there's 3 elements on top of a big log that has been sort of penetrated on angles. So there's a light angle and different depending on how you turn the log. But on top, you see 3 different elements, and also there are 3 different sizes, and they also cross on different angles. So pretty much after I have the idea pretty much in hand before I start. Sometimes, yeah, I have to change because sometimes the weight is a little bit unwieldy and the things become top heavy, or they just don't work even visually. But again, on the right, you can see what I mean by the angles of crossing and the interplay of shape. So so with wood or even stone, you don't have but so many times you can change something. It's not like clay that is malleable. So so I pretty much in mind, actually even before I start carving, exactly how the thing's going to work, pretty much.
So I'm going to open it up for everybody to ask you questions openly. So we're going to unmute everybody. And if you have comments or questions, feel free to jump in.
Okay, so my question is, if space were not a limitation, what would be your dream project that you would love to do?
I think that as long as I can come up with a decent idea and something that I would like to do, it doesn't really matter. It can be small, it can be large, but the main thing is, to me, the sculpture would have to be appealing and would be something I would like to do. So, no, I'm not really confined to space. In fact, but what I am confined to in my old age is moving things around with weight and so forth. So I have plenty, except for height. My studio is only 10 foot, so I have to do pretty much everything under 10 foot. But then I made some things 14, 15 feet, and then I take them outside and stand them up.
Let's see.
I think Scott has a question.
Let's unmute Scott. There we go.
So Thaddeus, first of all, thanks for doing this tonight, and hearing directly from you about these works gives it a whole another element. So you had mentioned some of your influences being Noguchi and Brâncuși, and when you look at your work, there's this immediate historical importance to it. How familiar were you with those 2 artists when you began? Did you really start working as an artist first and become familiar with those artists later, or was that sort of a familiarity to you early on?
Well, actually, I think long before I even thought about doing sculpture, I became familiar slightly with Brâncuși because I was taking a class in world culture, and they showed a picture of Brâncuși sculpture and an influence of an Afro-tribal piece. And of course, I'd never seen any African art because they surely didn't teach it anywhere. So I'd gone to school. So I was really taken aback by seeing these two different pieces. And so, but I met Noguchi twice here, but my main interest in Noguchi came from the Carnegie Internationals when he showed the I call them the marble plains, and those were the things that really struck me. How he was able to take these slabs of marble and turn them so that they created a volume. So those were that sort of influence.
And can I ask one more if I'm still unmuted before you mute me? So that is, what about scale of these works? When you first started, did you initially want to create things that were monumentally scaled, or how did it evolve? I know you talked about they're kind of pieced together and put together in pieces. So what did you, early on, were you thinking about larger works, or did you also do smaller works?
Well, I did a lot of smaller works, and but as I start showing in museums and galleries and so forth, I start making larger sculptures. You know, as they always, I guess, tell kids in Sculpture 101, if you can make it good, make it big. So so the big things will be noticed. And also, I remember during a show with a couple other people in Toledo, and the first thing they did, anything small, they said, well, this is going to be a big show with a big space, so anything small, I don't care how good it is, we should eliminate it. But no, I started making things that I thought that were room-sized things, things that would be dynamic, things that would be moving, and of course, you can do the same thing with smaller pieces, but they don't have the same impact, I don't think.
I think Paul Barrett had a question. Is that correct?
You typed it in, Tina. I think you can just.
I think Scott asked the same question. It was on scale. And then Annie Buttress had a question. I'm wondering if he makes each sculpture as independent standalone pieces, or do they fit into a
family? All my sculptures are made individually. The only time I've done anything that you might consider a family was for the Carnegie International in 2018, 2019, because the curator decided she wanted to put my work inside and outside. And so she wanted a component, or at least a group of work that would go outside. So that I made things that were, I thought, wind resistant, or at least things that the wind wouldn't knock down, and also things that were weather friendly. In other words, rain and snow might gather, but it would roll off. So I made very low table bench like things, and then I made a branch tree, which is in the show there, and the old piece. There are three of those different shapes, and then one's in the Karma show now. but because of that element that was going to be outside and have to do with the weather and the climate, that was really probably the only time I made a group of work. That except that one time I did make some work for the blind. We did a small show for the near the Carnegie here. There is an institution for the visually impaired, and I did a group of handheld sculptures that sort of reflected what I've done in a larger show in the Carnegie, and the people who had these difficulties with sight could pick up these sculptures in hand and get a feeling for my idea of shape. But ordinarily, what I do is just do individual sculptures, sort of how, as a musician would say, how what I feel like playing tonight, you know.
I think Tim has a question next. I'm going to unmute you, Tim.
Thank you. Thaddeus, you know, it's hard to imagine that this would happen, but if anything happens and this art thing doesn't work out for you, you could probably go out on the circuit and become a motivational speaker, because your story is really amazing. And one of the things I learned about you tonight is that you talked about yourself being a late bloomer, and I think it gives us all, you know, encouragement for any of us that are wondering what we're going to do with the rest of our lives. We can look to you and as encouragement that, you know, there's a lot of runway left and we can do whatever, you know, we can start second careers, and it's amazing what you've accomplished over the years. My question for you is, I was recently listening to another artist talk about over a period of years of making work. And this particular artist happens to have a warehouse full of stuff that didn't make it, that were the things that they were working on, and just for whatever reason, I don't know if he used the term, considered as failures. And I thought it'd be so cool to show up at this, to try to get into this warehouse and see what their idea of failure was. But I'm wondering, over all these years, do you have a stockpile of things stored away somewhere that you've worked on that haven't made it out into the world yet?
Well, you know, I have things that I don't know if there's stockpile, but I have things that no one seemed to want to show. But no, you know, I know a lot of people that burn things they don't like or throw them out. But I keep everything I make pretty much. Sometimes I look at them again and I use them with another sculpture, or turn them into something else, because I think that even the things that weren't as successful in some ways as I thought they would be, I think there is a germ of creativity in everything I do, hopefully. And even the things that I don't really show, I look at them and there's something in there that I like, and it can be transferred to another idea. So, but you know, people talk about me being a late bloomer. I remember I was in a show somewhere in Philadelphia some years ago, and in the and the reviewers said, "Well, you know, I'm not much interested in looking at people's work over 40," and I thought that was strange. But also, I think most people know of Alma Thomas and other people that started pretty late. Not that she started late, because she studied art in college, but she didn't show much till she was past her 50s. But it doesn't matter. The main thing is, if something is interesting for you to do, this is what life is about, and is creating something for your own life. And like I know now that people talk about the pandemic now and being, I know people are bored to death and they're running up the walls and stuff like that. But when I come home, I have not only the stuff that I do, my sons, my daughters, my kids, but all my friends, I'm surrounded by art. And sometimes I just sit here and look, not at my work, but at all the stuff I've accumulated. I don't say a collection, because a collection is something that you've systematically organized. But the mine is just things I could afford and things that I enjoy. And I think with life, I remember way back before they thought of people like me as being, what they call it, pseudo-intellectuals and stuff. I used to do a lot of talks or residencies at schools. And I remember I was at one school when a young man said, Mr. Mosley, what do you do with this art? If I'm studying art, what can I do with it? I said, well, the idea of doing art is to make your life immediately beautiful and interesting. If you don't get anything out of it, but no one else is going to get much out of it. I said, so if you never sell a thing, I said, you can always make a living doing something. I said, but if you never sell a thing, I said, if I never sold a piece of art, I wouldn't care. That wouldn't stop me from trying to be what I call an artist.
So we have another question. I'm going to unmute.
Hi, Thad. It's Kololo.
Hi, Kololo.
So Thad, I have a question.
What you doing in Alabama?
So I have a question for you. Could you tell us what a day in your studio is like?
Well, it all depends, Sometimes nowadays I go from 6, maybe 5, 6, 7 hours. Then sometimes if I'm nearing the end of something, sometimes of course, when I'm doing a show, like I was working on the International, sometimes I was there 12 hours. But the thing about it is that I go every day to the studio, and it's something I look forward to at night. I'm always thinking about what I'm going to do tomorrow. And I think that having something that you enjoy doing and that you want to do tomorrow, to me, is the important part of my life, because I think one problem with people is that I gave a talk, I think, over Carnegie Mellon, and I was telling the students there, one thing, you got to like yourself, because you're going to be alone a lot. And if you're not good company to yourself, you're not going to get much work done. But my day, I get up in the morning, I fix breakfast. One thing about fixing breakfast is then if I don't eat anymore till midnight, I've had enough food that carries me through most of the day. Yeah, so and then I go in the studio, but I get up and while I'm fixing breakfast, I play 2 or 3 record albums. I play. I have a lot of music on hand, so I play music, and then by 10 or so, I'm in the studio. So I'm there about the 4 or 5 or so every day, and I do pretty much the same thing every day. I come home, and watch TV, play music, and look at books and that sort of stuff, you know. But the main thing is that I enjoy, you know, going to work. And I know people that have studios, and they say, well, they're there once or twice a week. So I couldn't understand why they had a studio unless they had it for storage or something.
I think some people do use their studio as storage. Let's see. Does anybody else have a question that I missed? I want to make sure I got everybody. We might have time for one more. I don't think I missed anybody. So I just want to thank you, Thaddeus. Your insight into your work is wonderful. It's been a treasure spending this evening with you. And I also, again, want to thank Brendan and Sarah from Karma and helping us put this together. This has been so much fun. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. So, yeah, I hope everybody has a great evening.
Thaddeus, I will say that I've never seen so many people taking notes during one of these events before.
Well, thank you for having me.
Fantastic.
And you know, have a good life and stay healthy. Thank you.